talk, to be mindful of our time, but I believe that we will still be able to get through and get the message. Yesterday we talked about the Sabbath. We talked about how the value of the Sabbath is about relationship. It's about God protecting us from ourselves in regards to health. We talked about how it's to remind us of the fact that He's Creator and Savior. And the question is why Saturday and not Sunday? Why can't it be any day? And we're going to talk about that today. We're going to start with a poem, probably one you've never heard before, a poem you've never heard in your life, but here it goes. One day through the primeval wood, a calf walked home as good calves should, but made a trail, albeit askew, a crooked trail, as all calves do. Since then 200 years have fled, and I infer the calf is dead. But still he left behind his trail, and thereby hangs my moral tale. The trail was taken up next day by a lone dog that passed that way, and then a wise bellwether sheep pursued the trail over vale and steep, and drew the flock behind him too, as good bellwethers always do. And from that day o'er the hill and laid through those old woods a path was made, and many men wound in and out, and dodged and turned and beat about, and uttered words of righteous wrath, because 'twas such a crooked path. But still they followed, do not laugh, the first migrations of that calf, and through this winding woodway stalked, because he wobbled when he walked. This forest path became a lane, this that bent and turned again. This crooked lane became a road, where many a poor horse with his load toiled beneath the burning sun, and traveled some 3 miles in one. And thus a century and a half they trod the footsteps of that calf. Each day 100,000 route followed a zigzag calf about, and over this crooked journey went the traffic of a continent. 100,000 men were led by one calf, near 3 centuries dead. They followed still his crooked way, and lost 100 years a day. For thus such reverence is lent to well-established precedent. A moral lesson this might teach, were I ordained and called to preach. For men are prone to go it blind along the calf paths of the mind, and work away from sun to sun to what other men have done. They follow in the beaten track, and out and in and forth and back, until their devious course pursue, to keep the path that others do. But how the wise old wood gods laugh, who saw the first primeval calf. On many things this tale might teach, but I am not ordained to preach. We're looking at today when history played a trick on us, and I hope that you maybe picked up the message of that poem. The message of that poem is that long ago, someone walked a trail and made a trail. Some others began to follow. The trail got thicker or got wider and got more prevalent. And now that trail is just as accepted as the best way, even though it may not be such. As I said, we skipped ahead quite a way, or I cut out quite a bit. So I'm going to begin today with the story of another man that I met when I was in graduate school. His name is Dr. Samuel Bakioki. And he was a professor at Andrews University. He's now dead, but he was a professor at Andrews University. Let me tell you a little bit about his story. The outline before we talk about our thing. In 1975, this Protestant young man, enrolled in the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome. He became a point of history. He was a reference point in history because he was the first Protestant in 4 centuries of history as a university to graduate from the Pontifical University in Rome. So the Pontifical, the Pope's University in Rome. His doctoral research focused on unearthing the details of the story I'm going to share with you tonight or today. His research was completed. When his research was completed on his doctoral dissertation, he was awarded, or he was awarded his degree, which was summa cum laude, Latin for the highest honor. So he graduated summa cum laude. With the official license, now hear this, in Rome there, they had the official license, with the official license, the permission by the Roman Catholic Church to print an ecclesiastical or religious book. So, based upon his research, as it was reviewed by the Pontifical University in Rome, they said, we give you permission to publish this as a factual thing. He even received a commendation from the Pope at that time, Pope Paul VI. So the Pope even affirmed his studies and his dissertation. Sam was an Italian gentleman, one of the reasons why he went there. His dissertation, endorsed by the pontifical office itself, now tells us the story of this trick that has been played on us throughout history. Any study of the early church soon ends up in the cauldron of three explosive ingredients, three volatile constituencies, three different groups of people that were thrown together, and the consequences ended up with the writing of the story I'm going to tell you today. Those three empires, those three groups were the Jewish nation, the Roman Empire, which led to the Roman Church, and the newly formed Christian Church. Let's talk about the Jewish nation first. The history of the Jewish nation. These people, of course, were God's people. God sent them the promised Messiah in order to help them to find their way back to the truth and to remind them of their mission and their purpose in life. They did not accept that. They rejected that, in fact. But by the 1st century A.D., the Jews were under the iron thumb of Rome. Rome, the nation of Rome, was ruling over the Jewish nation. For many years, the Jewish people were very upset about this, even though the Romans were actually in some ways kind to them. They considered them a legal religion and allowed them to flourish in many ways within that empire. But the Jewish people, much like we would be, much like we were here in America under England, were not content simply to be under the umbrella of another nation. They wanted their own sovereignty. They wanted their land back. They wanted to be in control of their own world and to make their own decisions, not just on a personal level, but on a political level as well. And so what had once been peaceful, even which was rather peaceful in the time of Jesus, turned into a battle between the Romans and the Jews. Between the Romans and the Jews. Over time, this battle became so intense and this hatred became so intense that in the late 60s A.D., about 30 years after the time of Christ, there was a violent uprising that broke out against Rome. And with its iron fist, Rome sent the armies of Titus thundering against the holy city of Jerusalem and going after the holy city of Jerusalem. The citizens of Jerusalem held out for quite a long time, but in AD 70, Titus broke the resistance of Jerusalem and destroyed the temple, the golden marble edifice, the holy temple, the pinnacle of Jerusalem and the pinnacle of Jewish thought. The entire city was razed to the ground. It was destroyed. In fact, there's a site in Jerusalem where archaeologists have discovered actual burned timber remains of this opulent mansion that they estimate was from about that time. And there's the skeletal remains of a woman's arm clutching at the door of that mansion, the entryway of that mansion. And that was only the beginning of the cycle of this revolution that took place. In fact, it became so great that this whole thing took place. At least 2 million Jews were killed between AD 65 and AD 135 by the Roman Empire. That's more individuals killed than all the American servicemen who died in World War I, World War II, the Korean War, Vietnam War, Iraq War, Desert Storm, all of them combined. At least 2 million Jews were killed during this time period as they tried to revolt against Rome. Dio Cassius writes that after the total annihilation of Jerusalem in 135 AD, all of Judea became almost like a desert. But it was not only through the military that Rome sought to destroy the Jewish people. Emperor Hadrian, after the Bar Kokhba rebellion, decreed new political and fiscal policies against the Jews. He prevented any Jew under the threat of death to set foot in the new Roman city built over Jerusalem. Secondly, he outlawed the practice of the Jewish religion, declaring it religio illicita, an illegal religion. He forbade the observance of the seventh-day Sabbath. Two explosive ingredients put together, the Romans and the Jewish people. Out of this, the Jews were forbidden to keep the seventh-day Sabbath. Enters now the third ingredient of this historical conflict that took place. The growth of the Christian church, which is told about in the book of Acts. In the book of Acts, the Bible tells us in Acts chapter 6 and verse 7, then the word of God spread, and the number of the disciples multiplied greatly in Jerusalem, and a great many of the priests were obedient to the faith. A great many priests were obedient to the faith. At the risk of repeating myself, Christianity was a Jewish movement in the beginning, starting with the disciples of Jesus. So this is important for us to understand. So there was the Jews, there was the Romans, and then there was this new Christian movement that came up, and this Christian movement was, in fact, a Jewish movement. I talked in church a few weeks ago about a man by the name of Martin Luther. Any of you heard of Martin Luther? Not Martin Luther King, but the other Martin Luther, the great reformer. And some people have thought that Martin Luther was trying to tear down the Catholic Church. He was not, in fact, trying to tear down the Catholic Church. He wanted to remain a Catholic. He wanted to be a Catholic all his life. He wanted to be a priest, but he was trying to get the Catholic Church to reform. The people that were the early Christians, they were not against Jews. They were themselves Jews, and they saw them simply as another aspect of Judaism and part of this movement. This was part of this movement, and so they were Jewish in as of themselves. Well, because of this, as far as the Roman Empire was concerned, they were all one and the same, Jews and Christians. As far as the Roman Empire was concerned, there was no difference between them. They worshipped on the same day. The Jews worshipped on Sabbath. The Christians worshipped on Sabbath, the seventh-day Sabbath. They worshipped in the same places. The Jews worshipped in the neighborhood synagogues, and then the Christians worshipped in the neighborhood synagogues. As far as Rome was concerned, these two groups were one and the same. They were one and the same. But that was hardly the case in the minds of the Christians and the Jews as time went on. Because while Rome thought them the same, the Jews and Christians knew their major difference, and that major difference was, of course, Jesus. The major difference was Jesus. As the new Christians were convinced that Judaism without Jesus was a bankrupt system, they began to separate themselves from that. Which is why in the book of Acts, wherever the Christians went, they ran into conflict, resistance at the hands of the Jewish antagonists. They were fighting because the Christians were saying, you know what, you're not doing right. You're not living right. But the plot thickens. The Christians were under increasing pressure from the Romans. For a while, Rome ignored the fledgling new Christian group. But then this guy, funny-looking dude, by the name of Nero, who was one of the worst individuals in the history of mankind, he married a woman by the name of Sabrina. Sabrina converted to Judaism. This turned out to be a negative influence on Nero. Just remember, who you marry can have a big impact on what you do in your life. So one night, Rome was torched. Many believe that Nero was actually the one that torched it. Nero, seeing an opportunity, blamed the Christians for burning the city. And Christians were persecuted without mercy from that point on. They were covered with pitch and lighted up as human lampposts. They would put these poles up, and they put human beings on them, living human beings, and they would cover them in tar, and then at night they would light them. So as people would walk the streets, they would see these burning people and be reminded of who was in control